Acts, we find as Paul is on the second missionary journey, he stops in at Philippi. We've studied this not too long ago in our Wednesday night class, of course. But when he arrived in Philippi, he meets Lydia, you'll recall, by the riverside. She and some other ladies were gathered there for prayer and worship on the Sabbath day, and Paul and his company went there and worshiped with them. After that event, after he had preached to Lydia and had converted her to the Lord, he encountered a slave girl that followed him and his party around for a while and was, quite frankly, just an irritant and a distraction from what he was trying to do. And she was possessed with a demon that he removed. Called it out and told it to remove itself from her so that she would no longer be troubled. And you'll remember that got him in trouble, because there were those in the city of Philippi that were making money off of this girl, and their money supply was gone. So they got angry with him and had him thrown in jail. And when he was put into jail, we read in verses 25 through and 26 that night God came and rescued Paul and Silas. They were in the inner part of the prison. They were in stocks, locked up, where they could not get free, and God caused an earthquake to occur, and it broke the chains. It freed these men, as well as all of the other prisoners, from that which held them captive. And we know that the jailer, when he recognized and realized what had happened, he was certain all of the prisoners had escaped. And recognizing the penalty for his failure to secure the prisoners, he began a process where he was going to kill himself. And at that moment, Paul hollered out in verse 27 to the man, "Do not harm yourself, we are all here." There was no reason for the jailer to cause any harm to himself, because all of the prisoners were there. He was not going to stand in any kind of retribution for a failure on his part. So Paul hollered out for him to stop. And the jailer listened. And not only did he listen to Paul's appeal for him not to harm himself, he listened to Paul when he asked him, "What must I do to be saved?" And we know that in the record, he and his household were saved. They were baptized that very night. He owed his life to Paul. To Paul for calling out, "Do not harm yourself." And I would like to suggest that, like the jailer, many of us Christians at times do things to harm ourselves. We do things that cause difficulty or harm to our lives, to our being. And I'd like to take a few moments and consider some things tonight that occur within our lives that can harm us, that can create problems for us in our life. The first of these is the concept of worry. We know that when Paul wrote his letter to the church there in Philippi, in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, he said, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Turn it over to God. Don't be anxious for anything. And when he wrote that to those Christians in Philippi, he was echoing the same message that Jesus had communicated in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. You'll recall in that text in verse 25, he said, "Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life." And he goes on in that text and he talks about the way you're clothed, your food, all of that type of thing, because the Lord equips and clothes the birds of the air and feeds them and makes sure that they have everything that they need. And you'll remember that Jesus points them away from anxiety and rather to a seeking of the kingdom of God. Seek first the kingdom of God, verse 33 says. So there is an appeal that Jesus makes to put away these concerns that in a very real way weigh on our minds and our hearts, because of the things of this world. He says, don't worry about those things. Let God handle them. When Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 and 8, he says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. This is a lesson I wish that I could learn. I wish I had learned it a long time ago, and I wish I could solidify my understanding of it right now. Godliness, when married with contentment, Paul says, is of great value. But he goes on and he says, for we brought nothing into this world, and we cannot take anything out of this world. But if we have food and clothing, he says, with these we will be content. That's what we need to strive for. Don't worry about all of these things. Let God handle them, and let's be content with the blessings that He has given to us. We have a song in our songbook that certainly is biblical in its origin. Count your many blessings. If we were to count the wonderful things that God has done for us, maybe that would help us to be content and allow us or enable us to put aside the anxiety that so certainly can weigh on our minds. What we need is faith and prayer and less worry. And would that not make us much happier? Make our lives much less stressful? If we would just recognize the good things that God has done for us. Well, I would like to suggest another way in which we hurt ourselves is when we try to serve two masters. We try to balance things, the seeking of the worldly things versus the spiritual things. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, Jesus says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And then he makes it specifically clear what he's referring to. You cannot serve God and money. I don't know about you. I know about me. I lived my life, not yours. But there were times in my life when there was a pursuit of money. I had 4 mouths at home besides my own that needed to be fed. And it was an important factor. I needed to have the money to sustain my family. And if we're not careful, those things can overwhelm us. And we can get so caught up in the acquisition of wealth that we forget what's really important. Seeking first the kingdom of God. And not worrying about that. Making the determination immediately that we are not going to try to serve God and money. We're going to devote ourselves to God. In the book of Romans, in chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, Paul writes in this passage, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. By testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Don't be conformed to this world. It's easy to get caught up in that cycle, isn't it? Or was it just me? I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in trying to, if you will, keep up with the Joneses or the next door neighbor or the ones down the street that just got a new bass boat. It's easy to have those things weigh on our minds and forget that we should not have that kind of attitude. James said in James chapter 4 and verse 4, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be the friend of the world makes himself the enemy of God. Could it be made any clearer for us than this statement by James? If we strive to satisfy ourselves through worldly things, we become the enemy of God. Now that can be harsh, and that can be hard to come to terms with. But we need to recognize how these passages are trying to tell us that you've got two things pulling on you. And the image behind this, you remember the imagery that used to show up on Saturday morning cartoons when Saturday morning was the only time we got cartoons. You remember that, those of us that were older? And the characters that would have the good guy on one shoulder and the bad guy on the other. Well, that's what this is all about. You got two things whispering in your ear. The way of the world and the way of God. We hurt ourselves as Christians, as children of God, as followers and lovers of God. We hurt ourselves when we don't remember that the pursuit of these worldly things draw us away from God. One last passage that illustrates this point is John's writing in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. He said there very plainly, do not love the world or the things in the world. Again, could we get any clearer language? Don't do this. I can remember Dad making those kinds of things pretty clear to me. Don't do this. Oh, you mean don't do it right now or don't do it ever? It was pretty clear. And that's what John's trying to get us to see. Don't love the world. Why? He says, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Why would that be the case? The Apostle Paul, when he wrote to the church at Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 5, he says, be filled with the Spirit. The concept that is being articulated in these passages is we have to be filled with the love of God. We have to fill our lives with it and not with the world. The two cannot coexist. You'll either hate the one and love the other. Do you see that? Can we begin to put these things together? John goes on and he says, for all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world passes away along with its desires, but whosoever does the will of God abides forever. So we get ourselves in trouble. We hurt ourselves when we strive to serve two masters. We'll beat that horse just one little bit more. Loving money. That's the exact point of Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. You cannot love God and money. These two things cannot coexist. But do we also not recognize that when Paul wrote to Timothy in chapter 6 of 1 Timothy verses 9 and 10, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. I don't know about you, but I've looked at many people in the world that have been blessed with wealth and thought, I'd like to have the opportunity to prove I could handle it. Right? I'd like to be able to prove, Lord, that I can handle it better than they do. But I don't want that. How many stories have we seen flash across the news or be published in some type of a news article of these wealthy individuals, these prominent and popular people, whether they are in a political setting or in an entertainment setting or any other type of setting that gets them in front of people where they have great wealth and people admire or even envy them. How many of them do we see that are just inside torn to pieces? They've got no purpose in life. They've got no reason for living. In fact, so many of them, the reason they're on the news is because they've killed themselves. It's horrible. Why? Because you can't love God and money. That's what money does for you. That's the fulfillment that money can provide versus what God can provide. That's why Jesus on this earth, when he was here, taught what he taught, and why his apostles like Paul followed it up with these kinds of passages. He told Timothy, these people pierce themselves with many hurtful things. How many souls have been lost by pursuing money? In the parable of the sower, Jesus touched on this very thing when he talked about the seed that fell among the thorns. He says, this is the one who is the one that fell in the thorns, is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke out the word and prove it unfruitful. Takes it away. They had an opportunity. They were presented the gospel. They responded to the gospel. But the desires of the world choked out those things, those principles, those teachings, those ways of life that God requires of His children. It's choked out of their life, and they walk away from God to pursue them instead. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 23, Jesus said to His disciples, "Truly, truly, I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven." I want us to pay attention to a couple of things. First off, do you suppose Jesus might be right in warning this? I would say we should open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to recognize that Jesus knew what He was talking about. But I also want to say, just for the sake of balance, that Jesus didn't say rich people do not inherit, but it is difficult. So we're not suggesting that wealth keeps you from God. We're suggesting wealth is a threat to faithful service to God. I have known people that at least I have considered to be wealthy that have been very faithful, great examples of servants to God. But it is difficult. And that is what Jesus and these other writers that we've looked at here, Paul primarily, is trying to tell us. Well, another thing that hurts us is when we live immorally. Rather than living a pure life, we need to live a pure life if we hope to get ourselves to heaven, if we hope to not harm our efforts to do so. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 22, Paul writes there, "Do not be hasty in laying on of hands, nor take part in the sins of others." So don't do this. Instead he says, keep yourself pure. We need to be pure if we want to avoid hurting ourselves spiritually. James said in James chapter 1 and verse 27, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." So purity is that which keeps someone clean, that follows these directives, these commandments, and these instructions in the proper way to live. That's what can sustain us. And when we ignore that, or when we believe for whatever reason we figured out another way, all we're doing is hurting ourselves. We're causing ourselves trouble and pain. We live in a pleasure-mad society. It's all about fulfilling one's wishes and one's desires. And you can see that all over the place. It's not just innuendo, it's outright called. Just satisfy yourself. That's what's important in life. That's the wisdom of the world. That's what they're going to push and expect us to pursue. But Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 through 4, that there's times of difficulty coming. But the people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That's what happens. That's what is pulling us. It may be dressed up in some pretty outfit, but underneath it, these are the characteristics of that which is working to appeal to us. This is the world. And I would suggest that while Paul was saying this time is coming, we know that it is here. We see these things in our life every day. You don't have to watch television for very long to see these things evident through that media. You don't have to listen to popular music on the radio before you recognize, and that's of any genre, that these things are present. This is what the world is promoting in all of these areas. This time has come. But instead of seeking the kingdom first, some Christians seek these pleasures. Is that really what we should be engaged in? All we're doing is hurting ourselves. Another area that we hurt ourselves is with problems with our speech. In the book of Ephesians chapter 4, verses really 29 through 32, but there's two of these I want to look at, 29 and 31. In verse 29 he says, "Let no corrupt communication come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." So don't let corruption come out of your mouth. Foul language, dirty jokes, innuendo, those types of things, those are not befitting of what someone who espouses to be the child of God should have coming out of their mouth. Rather, what we should recognize is that what does come from our mouth should serve to build others up. What are we doing? What are we saying that is beneficial to others to understand, or maybe for the first time to be exposed to the will of God? That's what Paul is suggesting that we do. And then he goes on in verse 31 and he says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice." So don't justify these things if a person has hurt us and we're mad at them. It's not okay then either. Because he said to put that away as well. We should have nothing like that comes from our mouths. James in James chapter 3 and verse 10 says, "From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so." How can that be what God has asked for? How can it be compatible with godliness, with purity, with living the way that we should? It's not at all compatible. It's the exact opposite of that, and that's why James says that should not ever occur. In the book of Titus, in chapter 3 and verse 2, he says, "To speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, to show perfect courtesy toward all people." Rather than being mean and ugly and evil in our speech, we should be gentle with one another. But another aspect of misuse of our speech are lies. Lies can hurt us, and lies can hurt others. It is never appropriate for a Christian to be involved in the process of lying. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 9 says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices." That old self, that's where we've come from. That's the sinful person that might have engaged in those kinds of things. The Christian doesn't do that. Why? Because it hurts them, and it hurts those around them. These are the ways that we can most certainly behave that will hurt our standing before God as well as with others, our ability to help others. And how can you not remember what John wrote in Revelation chapter 21 in verse 8? "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters," now look at this, "and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." It's not the crowd we want to be in. What is more harmful to ourselves than that? These are just not behaviors that we should be engaged in any way as Christians. Careless words are another way in which our speech can betray us and hurt us and harm us. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 34 beginning, Jesus says, "You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good person out of the good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." These careless words are dangerous. They can cause huge problems for us. That's why we said earlier, when Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, he said, "Be filled with the Spirit." What is the origin of these things that Jesus just talked about in this passage? Out of the heart come these things. What are we putting in there? What are we filling ourselves with? The world or with God? Well, if we don't want to harm ourselves, we'll fill it with the Word. We'll fill it with God so that what comes out is what we've put there. Good things, kindness, gentleness, things that won't hurt us or others. This is certainly a way that we harm ourselves. Having hatred in our hearts is another way that we can hurt ourselves and hopefully our ultimate desire to get to heaven. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 15, John says, "Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him." No one that hates his brother, that person is a murderer. That's what it's likened to. It's expressed through anger. These are emotions that every one of us face and maybe even struggle with at times. And it might even be the case that the struggle that we have on various occasions is brought on, if you will, somewhat legitimately. We are truly hurt. We're mistreated. We're not dealt with the way we should be dealt with. And anger is a natural reaction, but it's a reaction that must be controlled so that it doesn't lead to these things. We have to keep from hurting ourselves with them. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, "You have heard that it was said of old, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable of judgment. But he says, 'But I say unto you that who is angry with his brother will be liable of judgment.'" Why is that? Because James says when you hate your brother, it's just as bad as murdering them. You have those feelings in your heart. And unfortunately, what's in our heart, what did we just learn? That's what comes out. So when we allow those things to get in our heart and fester, that's why we have the morning and the evening news filled with report after report after report of violence that takes place in our community. And if there's not enough to fill the space in the city of Indianapolis, they just have to go a few hundred miles north, and you could fill 2 or 3 hours with it out of Chicago, or maybe an hour or so south and east of here, and fill it with Cincinnati or any other city. These ideas that enter our head that cause us to be angry, they're dangerous, and they can separate us from God. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, Paul says, "Be angry and sin not." You know, there are occasions when being angry is I guess I would say it this way, it would be what you would expect the reaction to be. It would be normal, natural. Of course you're angry. Someone wronged you. So what does Paul say? Okay, be angry, but don't sin. Control yourself. Rein that in, because that's a danger that you do not want in your life. He says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. Because that anger can turn into worse things. It can fester in your heart and lead you to things that you do not want to do, like seeking revenge. That's what typically is at the root of a lot of the crimes that we hear about on the news, or we read about in news stories that we come across. It's people that are seeking revenge. But the Bible teaches us something very different. Romans chapter 12, verse 17 says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. And in verse 20 of that same chapter, he says, to the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, stick a fork in his eye. No, that's not what he says, is it? He said, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you will heap burning coals on his head. Overcome evil with good. That's what we are, I'll say it, challenged by God to do. That's what we're instructed to do. And it is, especially at times, a real challenge to do. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 30 and 31, for we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. With prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. Turn it over to God. He is going to repay those that are evil in this world. There is no reason for us to do so. Trust God. Leave it to him. Let him handle it. He's the righteous judge. And if we will let him handle it, we will save ourselves from harm that we can do to ourselves. Sometimes that harm, though, is harming others. And the Scriptures say a few things about that. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 15, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. That's what happens so often, and it typically happens between those that are the closest. You know, the Apostle Paul was writing to members of the church in churches in Galatia. They were biting and devouring each other. Members of the church. I'm grateful that we don't have that issue here, at least not to my knowledge at all. But it can be so threatening and damaging to us as a group if that was to happen. What we should be doing instead, in Ephesians 4, verse 32, he says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God God in Christ forgave you. That's what we should be doing instead, is being tender-hearted and kind and forgiving to one another. Because if you don't, what occurs is confusion and division. That's what develops in a local church. That's what develops in a home, in a family. And Jesus said in Mark chapter 3 and verse 25, if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. He was, of course, talking about their accusation that he was healing people because he had Beelzebub and he was casting out demons by the power of the devil. And he says, that didn't make sense. Because that would be a house divided against itself and it can't stand. Well, the same is true here. A family of God, whether that is the core family unit, husband and wife and children in a home, or a congregation, cannot survive if we bite and devour one another. So we need to be kind and tender-hearted in forgiving one another the way Christ has forgiven us. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the greatest harm that comes is when Christians become unfaithful. Motivated maybe by some of these things that we've considered, and certainly this was not intended to be a complete list of that which can harm us, but it should at least illustrate to us that these things are in fact harmful. And what they do is they take us away from God. They cause us to be unfaithful. And that's the ultimate expression of harm. Don't let that happen. Don't let that happen to you. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 in verse 8, Paul writes and he says, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. He was facing death. He knew it was coming, and he was ready. He was ready for it to happen. He was prepared. He felt himself prepared. But he says that this crown of righteousness that has been laid up is available to him, but not only to him, but also all who love his appearing. let's not harm ourselves. Let's protect this relationship that we have with God through Jesus Christ, through diligent attention in our lives to do what's right and to do what's helpful, not harmful to ourselves. If you've not obeyed the gospel, we would encourage you to do that. And then join us here at Decatur Township and help us, help each other to not harm ourselves, but to strengthen one another so that we may all get to heaven together. Let's be that kind of a family that binds and bonds together in a way that will build one another up. The warning that Paul sounded out, do not harm yourself, is a valid warning. It was to the Philippian jailer, and it is to us today. If you have need to obey the gospel, we encourage you to take advantage of it this evening, right now, as we stand and as we sing.